Creek Studios.
Before we begin, a content warning. This episode contains discussions of murder, violence, and trauma. Listener discretion is advised. The following story is drawn from public records, historical reporting, and community accounts. Some victim names and identifying details have been changed to protect privacy. Where the historical record contains gaps, certain narrative elements have been carefully reconstructed for clarity. Legal outcomes are described as they are recorded at the time of trial. When you grow up in a small Appalachian town, you learn pretty early what normal feels like. Not because anyone sits you down and explains it. You just know it. It's ingrained in you. You learn to recognize the sound of cars driving past your house every day. You know which porch lights stay on late and which ones go dark early. You know when the neighbor's dog is barking at something that doesn't belong. And when something feels off, people notice. Saltville, Virginia is the kind of town where people spend their whole lives. Families stay. Kids grow up together. Neighbors know each other's daily routines without ever really talking about them. And for the most part, life moves the way it always has. School lets out in early June, sometimes late May. Kids ride their bikes through town. Teenagers gather on porches or walk down to the river when the heat gets unbearable. And most nights, the roads are filled with cars driving slowly with their windows rolled down and music playing just a little too loud. That's what the summer of 1990 looked like in Saltville, at least at first. Because on June 14th of that year, an anonymous phone call was made to the Smyth County Sheriff's Office. The caller told them they might want to check on a house in the town of Saltville. Nothing dramatic, just a concern. But when deputies arrived at that house and knocked on the door, no one answered. And before that afternoon was over, a quiet Appalachian town would be trying to understand, trying to process something it hadn't seen in nearly 20 years. Before we get into this episode, if you're drawn to true stories from Appalachia, the kind rooted in history, folklore, crime, and things that people don't always say out loud, then you're in the right place. This is Roots and Shadows, the Real Appalachia podcast, and we release new episodes every Saturday. And if you decide to stay, go ahead and press that follow button. That way these stories don't have to come looking for you. Saltville is a small Appalachian town, tucked in a valley in the far southwestern corner of Virginia, located in Smyth County. It's a place rich with history and a few unexpected stories of its own. And this week's episode takes us to a part of town known as the Government Plant Section. It got that name years ago because of a U.S. Air Force contracted facility that once operated there, producing rocket fuel. And that fuel, made right there in little old Saltville, Virginia, helped power the rockets that carried the first man to the moon. So before putting this episode together, I drove to Saltville, spent an evening there, in the neighborhood where all this happened. While I was there, I ran into a couple of the town's police officers. When I told them what I was working on, they seemed interested, so I asked them if they knew the case. They paused for a moment, and that's when it hit me. I'm not as young as I used to be. Both of them were in their early 30s, and neither of them had been born when this crime happened. But for the people who lived here in 1990, it's a story that hasn't faded with time. Driving through the government plant section of Saltville, I stopped near the house where these events took place. After spending so much time reading the reports and researching the details, standing there brought the story into a different kind of focus for me. Seeing the place in person made it easier to picture how that day must have looked to the families who lived nearby, to the friends who knew them, and to the officers who first walked up to that door. Visiting these places can tell you things that reports and documents can't. Standing there, seeing how close those houses sit together, and how quiet that street still feels today, it helped me understand something about this story. Off in the distance, You can still see the remnants of the old smokestacks from the government plant. I looked at the streets where kids would have played, and the river nearby that would have offered some relief from the hot Appalachian sun. There's even a small store along the road, the kind of place where, years ago, you could imagine a few bicycles leaned up against the wall while kids ran inside for a cold bottle of pop. Standing there, taking all of that in, it reminded me of something important. That this didn't happen in some distant place that I never heard of. No, it happened right here in my backyard, in a neighborhood where people knew each other, in a town where families had lived for generations, and that makes what happened inside that house even harder to understand. This episode takes us back to the summer of 1990, and to a crime that shook this community in a way people here still remember. Wednesday, June 13th, 1990, was shaping up to be a warm early summer day in Saltville. Not quite summer by the calendar, but by Appalachian standards it had already begun, because when school was out here in the mountains, that signified the official start of summer. And according to historical records from the National Weather Service, the forecast that day called for sunshine and temperatures around 87 degrees. And with school out for the season, neighborhoods around town would have been getting into their normal summer routine. For two teenage girls, Melissa, 14, and Amanda, 13, both just finishing the school year at Northwood Middle School, it was the time of year when life suddenly feels wide open. Most days in a town like Saltville would have found the girls their age riding bikes through the neighborhood, meeting up with friends, walking down to the nearby river, or sitting on a porch somewhere talking, laughing, and deciding what they were going to do that evening. And in the middle of all that summer energy was their mother, Linda, raising two teenage girls in a small rural town where summers move a little slower, and families tend to stay close. The three of them were living in a house with Linda's husband, whom she had been married to for about 5 years. And like a lot of mothers raising teenagers in small Appalachian towns, her days would have been filled with the ordinary routines of keeping a household moving, making sure the girls were where they said they would be, reminding them what time to be home, and doing her best to hold together the kind of everyday family life that most people in that neighborhood would have recognized as perfectly normal. The next day, Thursday, June 14th, deputies from the Smyth County Sheriff's Office, along with officers from the Saltville Police Department, responded to a house in that neighborhood. Acting on the anonymous phone call suggesting they might want to check out a residence in town, they walked up the short sidewalk and onto the porch and knocked on the front door. They waited, and when no one answered, they knocked again, this time a little more firmly. Still nothing. In the quiet moments between those knocks, you can imagine what must have been running through the minds of the officers standing there on that front porch, hoping that whatever had prompted the anonymous call would turn out to be nothing at all. While some officers remained at the door, others began speaking with the nearby neighbors, and with the houses sitting as close together as they do in that part of town, several neighbors had already stepped outside, curious about what was happening. One neighbor told the officer she hadn't seen anyone at the house since the morning before. And with that, the uneasy feeling that had brought deputies there in the first place only began to go stronger. So, with officers unable to enter the home under the protection of the Fourth Amendment, and without a legally acceptable reason, the next logical step for deputies was to obtain permission from someone who lived there. If the homeowner could be located and consented to a search, officers would then be able to enter the house lawfully and determine whether there was any truth to the concern that had been reported. So, once the officers had the homeowner's name, they knew exactly who they were looking for. A be on the lookout alert went out over the radio to officers all across the county for the man and the pickup truck he was known to drive. And in a place like Smyth County, that kind of information travels quickly. Small Appalachian communities have a way of remembering details. People recognize vehicles before they recognize faces. Deputies know the roads folks usually travel and the trucks that belong in certain driveways. And when someone has had a previous run-in with the law, even if it's for something minor, their name tends to stick out. The homeowner, the one they were looking for, had been arrested a few times in the past for being drunk in public. Nothing serious, according to authorities, but it was enough that officers already knew who he was. They knew his name, and more importantly, they knew the truck that he drove. And in a county like this, that meant there was a good chance someone would spot him before long. And some time had passed, and the tension around the house continued to grow. A deputy radioed in that he had located the vehicle and was initiating a traffic stop. The truck pulled over without incident. As the deputy approached the vehicle, he confirmed that the driver was the homeowner they had been looking for, Mickey Wayne Davidson. Before the deputy could begin even asking questions, Davidson started talking. According to officers, he immediately began explaining what had happened at his house the day before. It was an unexpected moment. Deputies had only just located him, and before the investigation had even fully unfolded, the man they were searching for was already describing the very thing they feared might be waiting for them inside that home. Davidson was then transported to the police station, where officers continued speaking with him. And during that conversation, he eventually gave deputies permission to search his house. With that granted permission, officers finally had the legal authority they had been waiting for to enter the home and find out what had really happened inside. Back at the house, the deputies and officers who had remained on scene were still there on that quiet street, waiting, patiently, anxiously. They had spent hours outside that home, knocking on the door, speaking with neighbors, and trying to piece together what might be happening inside. The windows were covered, offering no view into the house, and the silence from within had only deepened the unease among the officers standing there. Then the call finally came over the radio. Permission had been granted. The homeowner, Mickey Davidson, had agreed to allow deputies to search the residence. For the officers standing outside that door, it was the moment they had been waiting for all afternoon. They could now legally enter the home and determine whether the concern that had been brought to their attention was simply a misunderstanding or something far worse. And with that confirmation, the deputies made their way back up the short walkway and onto the porch, preparing to step inside the home for the very first time. I was able to track down and speak with a retired deputy from the Smyth County Sheriff's Office, the same deputy who took the anonymous phone call that morning and later responded to the house along with other officers on that June day in 1990. He told me he still remembers standing there on the porch, waiting for permission to enter the home. It had been a long afternoon already, the knocking, the waiting, talking with neighbors, trying to figure out what might be going on inside a house where no one had been seen since the day before. And he said, when that permission finally came over the radio, they attempted to make entry, but when they tried to open the door, they immediately ran into another problem. The door wouldn't budge, even with the force of several officers pushing on it. It had been barricaded from the inside. The deputy told me they eventually had to force their way in, and when the door finally gave in, they realized why it had been so difficult to open. A couch had been pushed up against it from the inside, blocking the door. He said that as he stepped into the house and began to take in what was in front of him, it became clear almost immediately that something was terribly wrong. In his words, due to the nature, it was the worst crime scene he had seen in his 38 years of working in law enforcement. And that statement alone tells you something about the weight of what those officers walked into that day. I didn't press him for details about what he saw. I didn't need to. I had already read the medical examiner's report, but more importantly, that's not what this podcast is about. It's about the victims and the peoples whose lives were affected, the community that was shaken, and the long shadow something like this leaves behind in a place like Saltville. But during our interview, the deputy told me he could still remember that call as if it just happened yesterday. Over the course of a long career in law enforcement, he had responded to many scenes. Most of them, he said, fade with time, but this one didn't. This one stayed with him. Once inside, the first thing officers noticed was a mattress lying on the floor, covering something beneath it. One of the deputies carefully lifted the mattress. Underneath, they found the body of Linda, the 36-year-old wife of Mickey Davidson, laying face down on the floor. As the officers continued searching the house, they moved into a nearby bedroom. There on the floor, they discovered her children, the body of 14-year-old Melissa, partially covered with a trash bag, and next to her was the body of her 13-year-old sister Amanda, covered with blankets. The scene inside the house was overwhelming. Blood had been splattered across the walls, the ceilings, and the floors. The officers were trying to process what they were seeing. The mechanism of the injuries on the victims were difficult to comprehend. There were no gunshot wounds. What they were looking at were injuries caused by some form of blunt force trauma, wounds that could only have been made by an object used with tremendous force. As officers worked through the house, they were still trying to understand what kind of weapon could have caused injuries of that magnitude, caused that much destruction. The severity of the wounds made it clear that whatever had happened inside that home had been both violent and intentional. Standing there in what appeared from the outside to be an ordinary house in an ordinary neighborhood, the reality of the scene was difficult for even experienced officers to comprehend. Back at the police station, the homeowner, Davidson, now the prime suspect, continued to speak with officers. Davidson told them the weapon he had used was a crowbar. He told them exactly where inside the house they would find it. As that information was relayed from the police station back to investigators at the scene, the details Davidson was given began to line up with what officers were looking at inside the home. Piece by piece, the picture of what had happened there the day before was starting to come together. While putting this story together, I spoke with someone who knew the girls back then, and he shared a memory with me. He told me he rode the school bus with them. Their stop came after his, so for a long time he didn't even realize they were sisters. Melissa, the oldest, usually sat across the aisle from him. He remembered her as being a little quieter, a little more reserved, the kind of person who didn't feel the need to be the loudest on the bus. Amanda, on the other hand, had a bit more spark to her. As he described it, middle school boys would be middle school boys. Melissa would just roll her eyes and turn to talk to someone else. Amanda would let them know exactly what she thought about it. And from the conversation he remembers having with them, mostly with Melissa, there were no signs that anything was wrong at home. Nothing that would have made anyone think something terrible was just waiting around the corner. And when school let out that summer, he said he went to stay with his mother in Richmond, Virginia, about 5 hours away. One afternoon, he was outside when his mother came out and asked him a question. "Do you know Melissa and Amanda?" she asked. He told her that he did, and that he had rode the school bus with them, and that's when she told him what had happened. A few days later, he said the local Saltville newspaper had arrived in the mail, and there, on the front page, were the girls' yearbook photos. He said they looked exactly the way he remembered them from the bus that year, and that memory has stayed with him ever since. He told me it was the first time in his life that someone he actually knew, close to his own age, had died. Years later, he went on to become a police officer himself, and while he never said it outright, it's hard not to think that those memories of Melissa and Amanda and what happened to them had something to do with that decision, a quiet way of trying to stand up for people who can't stand up for themselves, and maybe, in some small way, honoring the girls he once rode the school bus with. As deputies continued working the scene, and ambulances were called in to transport the bodies, investigators were now beginning to assemble the pieces of what had happened inside that house. They had a confession. They had the weapon that had been used, and they were standing inside one of the most brutal and heartbreaking crime scenes the community had ever witnessed. Outside the home, word was already beginning to spread. In a town the size of Saltville, news like that doesn't stay quiet for long. People began hearing that something awful had happened. Conversations started on front porches, inside stores, and across phone lines as neighbors tried to make sense of what they were hearing. Questions began to move through the community. How could something like that happen here? Why would anyone do something like this? Saltville had always been known as a quiet Appalachian town where people looked out for one another, and up until that day, the town had not seen a homicide in nearly 20 years. But now, In the span of a single afternoon, that sense of safety had been shaken by a crime so violent and so difficult to understand that it will leave a mark on this community for years to come. Davidson went on to say that Wednesday morning around 10 or 11 was when he killed his wife and daughter. And, not long after, he just left. Just walked out of the house like it was just a normal day. A construction worker by trade, the neighbors likely thinking he was just leaving for work. Exactly where he went that day and night remains unclear. But what is known is that by Thursday morning, the day after the killings, Davidson had shown up at the home of a relative. And according to reports from the relative, Davidson told him, "I've got bad troubles." Then he said something even more alarming. He told his relative that he had killed all three of them. Davidson then proceeded to ask the relative if he would help him dig a grave and bury the bodies. The family member refused. Instead, he reported the conversation and Davidson's visit to local police in his town. The family member later told authorities that Davidson spoke clearly and deliberately when describing what had happened, and that there was a faint smell of alcohol on his breath, but he did not appear to be drunk. Later, ambulances were called, and the victims were transported to Roanoke, where autopsies were performed by the chief medical examiner for Western Virginia. The findings confirmed what deputies had already begun to understand inside the house. Linda had suffered multiple severe blows to the head. Melissa and Amanda had also been struck repeatedly. All three deaths were determined to be a result of blunt force trauma. Investigators were also able to confirm something else Davidson had told them. The injuries were consistent with the use of a crowbar. For investigators working the case, the physical evidence inside the home and the findings from the medical examiner matched the details Davidson had already provided. Piece by piece, the investigation was confirming what had happened inside that house on that June day. And in speaking with an EMS provider who responded to that house that day to assist with transporting the victims, he described the scene as graphic and deeply unsettling. But more than anything, he told me what stayed with him was the fact that there were children involved. In all his years working in emergency medical services, he said this was the worst call that he had ever responded to. With the investigation now complete, the case moved into the court system. A Smyth County grand jury formally charged Davidson with 3 counts of capital murder for the killings of his wife and her 2 daughters. Under Virginia law, when multiple people are killed during the same act, the crime can be prosecuted as capital murder, one of the most serious charges the state recognizes. The case eventually moved into the Smyth County Circuit Court. Rather than forcing the case through a full trial, Davidson chose to plead guilty to the murders. Before accepting those pleas, the judge carefully questioned him in court to make sure he understood what he was doing. Davidson confirmed that his attorneys had explained the charges against him and the possible punishments he could face, including death. He also acknowledged that he had the right to undergo further mental health evaluation, but chose not to participate in them. The court determined that he was competent to stand trial and capable of making decisions about his own case. After hearing testimony and reviewing the evidence, the judge accepted Davidson's guilty pleas and found him guilty on all 3 counts of capital murder. As the case moved into the penalty phase, where the court determines the sentence, something happened that surprised many people who had been following the case. Davidson once again instructed his attorneys not to present any evidence on his behalf. He chose not to call witnesses. He chose not to present a defense. Instead, the court proceeded with hearing the evidence presented by the Commonwealth. After reviewing the details of the case, along with the findings of the probation report and the evidence from investigators, the judge concluded that the murders involved an extreme level of violence and brutality, and on July 11, 1991, the court sentenced Mickey Davidson to death. Under Virginia law, death sentences automatically receive review by the Virginia Supreme Court. But even during that stage of the process, Davidson refused his right to this automatic appeal. Before allowing that to happen, the Virginia Supreme Court required the trial court to take another careful look at Davidson's mental condition. The justices wanted to be certain that he fully understood what he was doing and what he was giving up by saying he didn't want to appeal. The original judge questioned Davidson again and reviewed the findings about his mental competency. And after that review, the court determined that Davidson was of sound mind and capable of making his own decisions. With those findings in place, the legal process moved forward. An execution date was set, February 3rd, 1993. And with that, Davidson was transferred to the state prison system, where he was placed in a cell on Virginia's death row, only a short distance from the execution chamber. And with that, the legal chapter of the case began to close, leaving behind a crime that the people of Saltville would not soon forget, and a man who, by refusing to fight for his life in court, seemed to be accepting the punishment that awaited him, essentially telling the courts, "I want to die." For a time, Davidson had made it clear that he did not intend to fight the sentence. At what would have been one of the swiftest executions carried out in Virginia history, the timeline was moving at an unusually fast pace. Just a little over 2 years had passed since his conviction, and in a system where many men have spent decades on death row waiting for their appeals to run their course, Davidson appeared to be on track for one of the shortest paths from conviction to execution the state had ever seen. But as that execution date drew closer, something changed. Just 2 days before he was scheduled to be put to death, Davidson reversed his course. He suddenly informed his attorneys that he did want to pursue appeals after all. The decision forced the courts to step in. The Virginia Supreme Court granted a stay of execution just hours before the sentence was to be carried out, sending the case back to the Smyth County Circuit Court for further proceedings. Over the next several months, Davidson's position continued to change. At times he indicated he wanted to fight the sentence. At other times he said he wanted the appeals dropped so the execution could move forward. At one point, according to court records, he was calling his attorney multiple times a day, sometimes expressing a different decision each time. Eventually, Davidson again told the courts he wanted to stop the appeals and allow the execution to proceed. Years later, the legal process had finally run its course, and a final execution date was scheduled. Just before the execution began, Davidson spoke a few final words. "I'll say my last words to the Lord," he said. "I guess that's really all that needs to be said." Davidson had never denied what he had done and had repeatedly said that he believed he deserved the punishment he received. And on October 19th, 1995, at 9:41 p.m., 38-year-old Mickey Wayne Davidson was executed by lethal injection at Greensville Correctional Center in Jarrett, Virginia. By now, you've probably wondered the same thing many people did when they first heard this story. Why? What would possess someone to commit such a horrific act of violence against the very people who were supposed to be their family? Well, according to the statement Davidson gave investigators, the answer he offered was as simple as it was disturbing. He told them that his wife had decided to leave him and return to her former husband, taking the girls with her. In his own words, he explained it in this way: "I just couldn't stand to see her go back. I just couldn't stand to see them go back. So I took a crowbar and killed them, Linda, and the 2 kids." And something that I thought was really bizarre, in the years leading up to his execution, while sitting on death row, he purchased a burial plot for himself in a Saltville cemetery. While that don't seem strange in itself, it was the location of the plot that caught my attention. The plot was located next to the graves of the 3 victims he had murdered, and that is the place where he was eventually laid to rest. Out here in Appalachia, stories like this don't just belong to court records or old newspaper clippings. They settle into the memory of a place. They get carried quietly through generations, told in pieces on front porches and across kitchen tables. Because in towns like Saltville, the roots run deep. Families stay here for decades, sometimes centuries. Children grow up on the same streets that their parents did. Neighbors know each other's voices, their vehicles, the rhythm of their daily lives. Those roots are what hold communities together. But every now and then, something happens that casts a shadow across those roots. The shadow in this story was one man, and the violence he carried into a home that should have been safe. And yet, even in the darkest moments, the strength of a place like this shows itself in other ways. In the neighbors who spoke with officers that day, in the deputies, EMS workers, and investigators who still remember the weight of what they saw, and the people who, even decades later, still remember two teenage girls who once rode the school bus through town, and a mother trying to raise her family the best she could. Those are the roots, and those roots are stronger than the shadow that tried to cover them. And another thing, there is one piece of this story that has always lingered in the background. That anonymous phone call that first brought deputies to the house. To this day, no one has publicly confirmed who made that call. And sometimes, when you step back and look at the timeline of events, it leaves you with one final question. Was it someone who knew something was wrong? Or was it the man at the center of the shadow, trying to bring the story to its inevitable end? That may be something we never truly know. But what we do know is this: the lives of Linda, Melissa, and Amanda were rooted in this community. And long after the headlines faded and the courtrooms emptied, those roots remained. Because here in Appalachia, roots have a way of outlasting the shadows. This has been Roots and Shadows, the Real Appalachia podcast, where every root tells a story and every shadow hides one.